least in some capacity. Like I said, I was working in the industry. And it really created this channel for energy that I wasn't thinking about, am I going to die? And frankly, Hodgkin's lymphoma is not one that will normally kill you, a young, healthy person, but I know people that have died from it. But that's not kind of where my mindset was at that time. I really was just like, I'm going to continue doing the things I like to do, and just not worry about it. And if I think looking back now, if I didn't have fishing, it might've been different. I responded really positively to treatment, and, there's a picture here. That's me getting chemo and tying flies in the treatment room. I would, my buddy Brett, who's pictured next to me, we would meet up and go fishing after I had treatment. I'd get treatment for 4 or 5 hours down at the Cleveland Clinic. I'd still have a few hours of daylight left. This was in the middle of steelhead season, and I would go fish until dark. I'd get home and I'd lay on the couch and I wouldn't be able to move for hours after that. But, that was that outlet for that, what could have been negative energy. And frankly, I didn't put all these pieces together at the time. I was just living my life as normally as I could. But as I said, as I look back on that experience and think about, why was I able to cope with that so well? I think fishing had a big part of it. And it's kind of shaped how I think about what fishing means to me now. Perspective is everything, right? So another big thing, when I was 24, 25, really all through my 20s, again, fishing was my whole life. I was getting to go really cool places, traveling a lot, spending a lot of time on the water. And then I had a kid, and then I had another kid, and then I had another kid. I have 3 sons now. So as any of you know who have children, that's an experience, or that's a perspective shifter for sure. But also the time, right? It's a time commitment. I don't have the time to do all that fishing that I used to do anymore. It's just not feasible. I still do my share, but it's not like it was during my 20s. And so for me now, when I do get to go, it takes on a little bit of a different feel. And I think about other things. I think about, when I'm with my kids. The picture on the left is me at 3 years old. And the picture on the right is my oldest on the same lake, at 5 years old. And I think about all the things that have happened from a life of fishing positively for me. I already talked about how it helped me with my cancer experience, but all the friendships, career opportunities, all this other stuff, that was all kind of came from my passion for fishing. So, those are some of the things that I think about that have really shaped, how I process my time on the water these days. And, Jess mentioned this, but at any point, my goal for this, I'm not an expert on a lot of things. I'm not a life coach or any kind of guru. I wanted this to be really a discussion. So if there's anything you guys, feel like is worth adding to the conversation, please, unmute and chime in. So I put this in there because I don't think that we often really consider this question. Why do we fish? If you're on the call tonight or you're part of Ohio Women on the Fly, fly fishing obviously means something to you in your life. You're dedicating time to be a part of a presentation like this, to go on outings, but why? Why do you like it? And I think we reflect on that sometimes, but probably less often than we should. For some people, it's a deeper connection with nature that draws them to it in the first place. For me, I always loved fishing from a very young age, without even really thinking about it. And I almost fished as if I had to, as if my life depended on it. And that turned into a deeper connection with nature, a deeper appreciation for ecosystems and environmental health, and really I would call secondary hobbies or passions like hunting, like foraging. But for some people, they're seeking that connection in the first place, and that's why they come to fly fishing. Camaraderie, I think, is a big thing. What you guys are doing with this group, getting together with outings, especially with everything that we've gone through in the last year, spending so much time at home and away from people. Fly fishing has presented an opportunity to connect, to see people face to face, to share stories. And I think, as a society and as a culture, we've definitely realized how important that is. And I think that's part of the reason I've noticed, and I think, the fly fishing industry as a whole has definitely noticed over this last year this huge surge in interest. And it's because of what the sport provides and this ability to be outside and with other people and do it in a safe way. Tranquility. For me, fishing used to be a big party all the time. And now, to be honest, sometimes it's an opportunity to get away from the kids and just be at peace. Um, I never liked fishing by myself. I would do it because I just had to fish. But now every once in a while, it's nice to be out there and just have the dog next to me and not talk to anybody, not talk to, a 3-year-old who wants me to play the Sandlot all day long. So that's something I think about a lot these days. Is it the challenge? It's definitely a sport with a big learning curve. And for me, I think over the years that finding that next challenge, whatever it is, if it, whether it be a different kind of species, whether it be catching a fish on a certain fly or a certain way, catching a big fish, the challenge, there's always a new challenge in fly fishing. And I think people that grab onto that tend to really get into the sport deep because you can always find that next thing that you've never done. So, I throw those things out there just as, not that there's a right or wrong reason to fish by any means. But I think it is healthy to just stop and think like, what is it really that's moving me to do this? And I had a moment, it's funny, I told Jess this story a couple of weeks ago as I was kind of getting ready for this presentation. This was, I had to go back in the archives, but I thought of this story that I had written, and it was actually 8 years ago, a little over 8 years ago. And this was before Instagram was what Instagram is now, and was kind of maybe just starting to be that way. But I was fishing one of my favorite steelhead rivers, and I was with buddies on this trip, but they were not with me. They were downstream around the corner and out of sight. And I was swinging a fly through one of my favorite spots on that river. And I hooked this fish, and I knew right away that this was a big fish. And I don't really care much about big fish, but it's nice to catch one once in a while. And I knew that this was one. And once you know that, you're dying to get them in. I land this fish, and what I remember, and it hit me kind of almost immediately, is that what I remembered feeling was not this excitement or this amazement or this feeling of awe looking at this fish in the water. I felt a little bit of that, but it was kind of, I don't want to say washed away, but it was overshadowed by this feeling of there's nobody here to take a picture of me holding this fish. And I was like, it dawned on me later as I thought about that, like, what am I doing? If I just landed, what at that time was probably the fish of a lifetime for me. And my feeling looking back in the moment was not like, that was amazing. It was like disappointment that I didn't have this picture, that I couldn't share with people. And that was that, like, what are you fishing for in the first place moment for me. And it stuck with me ever since then, about, just keeping that in mind, that if you're fishing for a picture or for a status or to make yourself look a certain way or feel a certain way for other people, not for yourself, something is out of alignment and you need to examine that. So that was the motivator for like this talk, is like that feeling. Cause I think other people have had that feeling, I'm sure, where you caught a fish and maybe your buddy took a picture or your friend took a picture and they didn't get the right picture. And you had this feeling of like being bummed that the fish wasn't going to be well represented when you shared that photo with other people. And it's like, I've had the same feeling, trust me. But it's like, there should be, who cares? Like, that wasn't why you were fishing in the first place, was it? But it just, you need to stop and think about that sometimes and check yourself. So I tried to think about like some things that over the years, whether it be subconsciously or things that I was very intentional about incorporating into my mindset for how I process my time on the water. And I tried to put those together here to give you guys some things to think about. So I think this is kind of the crux of it, really. Everything after this doesn't matter if you can't be honest with yourself about, number one, who you are as an angler, but also where you're at on the experience and skills spectrum. If you are going out and expecting to do something that you don't have the skills or experience to do, there's a good chance you're going to walk away feeling disappointed, and you're not really being fair to yourself. And I think, fly fishing is the ultimate aspirational marketing sport. Like, and it's been that way for a very long time. It's so visually attractive that companies and brands and influencers use it to paint this picture of what it should be like. And the reality is it's not always like that. And more often than not, it's only like that for a very few people. And that could be any, fishing environment or situation. So I think you have to start with saying like, okay, well, realistically, where am I at on the spectrum? And then what would be a good, what would be a good day of fishing, knowing what I'm capable of, what I've done, and what I can do. So that goes with this, setting appropriate expectations. If you go on your first saltwater fishing trip and you plan on catching a permit and you've never done that before, and you've never thrown an 8 weight or 10 weight into a stiff wind, you're setting yourself up to be disappointed when you really shouldn't be disappointed, because it's friggin' hard to catch a permit no matter who you are or how good your skills are. And I've seen this happen. I've been that person before too. Even with lots of fishing experience, I've gone and tried fishing for a new fish or doing something that I'd never done before, and I expected to have success, and then I was disappointed when I didn't. When in reality, what I should have been going into that situation with was a mindset of wanting to learn, asking a lot of questions. For me, I like the information gathering part of the process. So when I get to travel or fish with other people on their home water, I love to just pepper them with questions, just to understand like how they've come to be at that level of a true expert in whatever it is, that we're fishing for, or the place that they're fishing. So I think expectations are really important. And sometimes we're probably not honest with ourselves or fair to ourselves with the expectations we set for a trip or an outing or just a day on your home water. Focus on problem solving and adaptation. This is something I think a lot about. Our bread and butter fishery up here is our steelhead fishing, right? And that's where I cut my teeth. It's where I guide. It's something I'm very passionate about. And what I think, as I reflect on the conversations I've had with fishing friends and other guides, or just the things that like get me excited about fishing for those fish, is that they're unpredictable. It's this constantly trying to solve this puzzle of like, well, the fish were in this spot today, where are they going to be tomorrow? And then going to that spot and those fish not being there and you not catching them, and then coming home and saying, why weren't they there? Why didn't they do what I thought they were going to do? And you can never, there's no answer, right? You'll never solve that puzzle or that problem. And you could give countless examples with fishing for other species or fishing other places. But for me, it's like trying to crack that code, knowing I'll never crack it, and not only that, like if you could catch, if somebody gave you, power to catch any fish you ever wanted to catch, it wouldn't feel the same, would it? It wouldn't be fun knowing that you're going to go catch them, and that it wouldn't be hard and that you wouldn't be challenged. And I think just thinking about that helps enrich the experience a little bit. I like this quote about adaptation. It's one that I think about from time to time when I'm, in that mindset of like trying to be better as an angler, trying to figure out the fish. That's part of the fun. That's part of the game for me. Another quote by the legendary fly angler Bruce Lee: "You must be shapeless, formless like water. When you pour water into a cup, it becomes the cup. When you pour water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. When you pour water into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can drip and it can crash. Become like water." I think I used to think about this quote or this idea as like being a better angler, and I still do. But kind of what I opened the talk with and saying like, I'm not the same person or angler that I was when I started anymore. And so, I have to kind of adapt my mindset and my goals and expectations for really where I'm at in my life, where I'm fishing for, what opportunities I have. So, I think that quote carries a lot of weight. One of the things I encourage people to do, to get better as an angler, is look for patterns. And patterns can be, with steelhead fishing, that's a big thing for me, is trying to pattern a fish that's constantly moving, maybe not in the same spot 2 days in a row, That changes throughout the seasons. We have a 3-season steelhead fishery. So, the fishing in the fall and October when the water's 60 degrees is a lot different than it is in December when it's 34 degrees. But I look for patterns throughout the season that help me predict, with some degree, some chance for success of where those fish are going to be, what they're going to be doing. And I think you take that same approach to anywhere or any fish that you might go after. Applying diverse experience. This is something that I tell people a lot. I find over the years that we all kind of like find our niche. We find our thing in fishing, whether that's fishing for trout or fishing for warm water species or steelhead. We all tend to gravitate towards, one thing that's like, this is going to be my core area of expertise, or this is just what I enjoy the most. But I do think if you want to be more successful as an angler, or you enjoy that, some of those things I talked about before, that problem solving component of the sport, that challenge component, that having diverse experience, fishing different places, fishing for different species, not being one dimensional in your techniques, that is a way of enriching your knowledge. And it's a way of, increasing the likelihood that you're going to be able to solve whatever the problem at hand is, for that fish that you're fishing for. Don't be a slave to convention. So this is something I've noticed a lot too. And I was talking to my buddy the other day about this. I think with the onset of, with the internet being what it is, and with so much information being out there, and you're cruising your Instagram feed and you see everybody tying the same flies. And when everybody talks about going fishing for big trout, they're posting the same pictures of the same flies. It's not because those flies don't work, but it's also not that those flies are the only flies that work, or that a certain technique or a certain fly line is the only way to get the job done. And I've had to be reminded of that like so many times over the years. When I was working for Orvis and managing the fly shop, it was my job to be the expert. So when somebody came in and said, "Hey, I'm going to go do this. What do I need?" I had to have an answer for them. But I think, and I was very young, I was in my early 20s when I was doing that. And I think after a while that went to my head, that there's a way to do whatever it is that you're trying to do. If you're going trout fishing, you need a 5-weight, for example. I'm just making stuff up, but you get the idea. And I remember being humbled a couple of times by customers coming in and saying, "Hey, check this out." And these were customers that I had a relationship with, and they'd give me a fly and say, "Hey, yesterday I just crushed them on that." And early in my experience there, I would kind of look at a fly and say, "That's not the right fly." And as that happened more and more over time, the revelation was more like, there's more than one way to skin the cat. And if you're not experimenting, or if you're thinking that one person's approach to a certain technique or a certain fish is gospel, you're going to miss out on opportunities to learn new things, and also to have a trick up your sleeve for when that's not working, because there will be a time when that's not working. And the more things that you can try or play around with, the more likely you're going to be able to solve that problem. And then paying attention to the variables in each fishing situation. So, conditions being the most obvious one. What are the conditions like? And not fishing the same way every time that you go, because conditions are different. I've never been able to, as much as I've always said that I should, I've never been able to consistently keep a fishing journal over the years. But one way I do that is I try to take, this is not to sound counter to what I was saying before, but I try to take pictures of things like a fish in the water so I can see the water conditions or the scenery. So, and I look at the date stamp, the time stamp on the picture of my phone. And then when I'm sitting around and it's February and it's snowing and the rivers are frozen, and I go back looking through pictures over the years, it almost serves like a fishing journal for me. And I can see, wow, I had a great day of fishing that day, and these were the conditions, and better yet, if you can keep a journal, I think you can learn a lot more in a much shorter amount of time about how changes in conditions impact, your likelihood for success, say with a certain technique, or how you might need to change your approach, for that particular situation. Focusing on a goal, ambition, or problem to solve. So I want to clarify what this is. Like, what this became for me over the years was like, I think as I was, when I was early in my fly fishing learning process, it's so easy to be overwhelmed with just the information. Which fly do I use? What's the right rod setup for today? How many rods should I bring? How deep should I set my strike indicator in this spot? It's just overwhelming, right? So what I kind of like subconsciously over the years started doing was say, today, if I get the chance to fish, what I'm going to focus on is steelhead fishing. I want to catch a fish swinging a fly. That's my goal for the day. And I'm not going to get distracted by, grabbing another rod and trying to run a strike indicator through there. And I'm not going to worry too much about fly selection. Like, I'm just going to simplify it, eliminate as many variables as possible, and focus on that one objective for the day. Maybe it's, if you're trout fishing, it's catching a fish on a dry fly. Maybe you've had trouble catching trout on a dry. Well, if you don't do it, if you don't try it, you're not going to be able to catch that fish, right? So I think like eliminating some variables and saying, this is what I want to get better at today, or this is the thing I want to do today. I tied this fly. I'm really excited about it. I don't know if it's going to work. I'm going to fish it as hard as I can. I'm going to fish it different ways, and I'm going to see if it passes the test. And that's just, again, this is all about making time on the water more enjoyable. And it may not mean catching more fish on that particular day, but it probably will mean learning something useful that you can apply later. I was talking about being early in my steelhead fishing and being kind of overwhelmed. And I remember when I was very young and I first started steelhead fishing, I started with a spinning rod, just fishing live bait. And then I got into the fly fishing thing, and I would carry a spinning rod with live bait, and I would carry fly rod. And you can guess how much I ended up fishing the fly rod the first year or two. It was so easy to fall back on that crutch and say, well, they're not catching they're not eating the fly, so I'm going to throw the bait in there. And then when I got to a level of competency with the fly rod, then it became spey casting and two-handed casting and swinging flies and catching a fish swinging. And I would carry two rods. I would carry a strike indicator, an indicator rod and a swinging rod. I didn't fish the swinging rod very much, and it took me a long time to get that, that first fish under my belt and eventually get to a place where I was competent in that too. And that didn't happen until I stopped carrying two rods. I just said, today I'm going to go swing flies, and I'm going to get better at it. I'm going to get better at my casting. And eventually I did get to a level of competency, and I could apply that to a lot of things over the years with different fishing experiences. But you always got to be ready for curveballs, right? So blown out rivers, broken rods, misplaced hooks like this one here, forgotten waders, all present opportunities to observe and learn. And I could have added a lot of other things to that list that have happened to me over the years that were less than ideal. But a couple of stories, things that I've experienced that kind of remind me that, like, when something goes south, and it will, you can't let it ruin the day. And a few examples. So I remember we were talking about a trout stream earlier, a couple of us, and I remember fishing this stream. It was my home river in college, and it was a tailwater, and it could, they could jack the water up. They could release a bunch of water without a warning, and the rivers goes from perfect conditions to blown out in a matter of an hour or two. So I remember the first time I showed up over there, I'd planned on going fishing. I got in the car, I drove over there, and I got there, and the river was way over its banks, blown out. And I thought about, I was obviously disappointed, and I thought about going home. And I was like, well, I'm looking at the river, and I'm like, well, it's not that dirty. It's really high, but it's not that dirty. And I bet, I thought about, this is back to diverse experience. And I thought about fishing at home, and I'm like, we catch steelhead in much dirtier water than that. And the fish are in here somewhere. I'm going through this whole mental process in my head, right? Long story short, I ended up standing on the bank halfway between the parking lot and where the normal, river bank would be, and fishing the edge of that bank, with a strike indicator and super heavy split shot and a couple of worms. And I caught some of the biggest trout I had ever caught on that river. And they were all, within 8 inches of the bank. And I was like, it's a difference in, like, mindset of being like, well, it's too high to fish, because somebody that I know told me that when it's that high, don't fish it. But I was like, I could go home or I could try it. I had a similar experience on that same river, where I showed up another day. River was blown out. I hadn't expected that. and I just ended up going for a walk. And I remember the water started dropping, and I saw there was an area, like a rocky area on the side of the bank, and there were a bunch of little sculpins, little bait fish that had been washed up and kind of trapped because the water had receded so quickly. And I hadn't, I'd heard about sculpins before. I was very new to trout fishing, but I hadn't really thought about that. So what did I do? I went back to my fly tying desk. I tied a bunch of flies that I thought imitated them, and sure enough, I ended up finding that that was one of the most effective ways to fish that river in high water in the winter, was fishing a big heavy sculpin on a sink tip. If I had just gotten back in the car and gone home, I wouldn't have learned anything from that. Another story, that I think about when I think about this idea of like not, not succumbing to the circumstances, if you will. I remember leaving a rod at home by accident. So I show up to the river and I was unable to fish. And I ended up, going for a walk, and there were other people fishing. And I ended up climbing a bank and getting up to an elevated perspective and being up in this tree and just watching. And it was interesting to me, and it was something I've used in guiding and fishing since, is like just that little change in actual physical perspective of being at an elevated position, how much more I could see about, that particular run, which I had fished hundreds of times. I knew where the fish, I thought, usually sat, but I got up to this spot and I could see things with much more clarity. I could see how the other angler that happened to be fishing it was missing the spot where the fish were, and he was fishing that spot the same way that I normally would have fished it, not ever having just changed my perspective, gotten to that elevated position on a different side of the river. And it was just like, it's a simple, silly little thing, but it was like a light bulb moment of, just that difference in perspective, and saying like, well, if I always fish this spot from the same side in the same way, how much am I missing? Or how often am I not really putting the flies where they need to be? My buddies and I joke about this a lot. Control the controllables. So there's so many things, out of your control when you're out there. You can't make the fish bite. You can't make the conditions be ideal. But just doing things like, packing a good lunch, bringing a couple good beers along, having good company, being dressed for the weather. Those are things that I think, sometimes we just forget about, and we're such in a hurry to get out there and catch fish, that we don't think like, hey, let's take a break, sit down, share a story, start a fire. And that's something over the years I've done a lot more of. When I go fish, I do a lot less fishing than I used to. And it, it slows things down. And I think it enriches the experience. Sharing knowledge enriches the experience and often makes you better. What I meant by this is like early on in my guiding, or when I was, I've gone through guide school out in Victor, and I had gotten to a point where I was competent enough to be a guide, but I wasn't really a seasoned guide yet. I was still learning a lot myself about fishing. And it wasn't until I really started teaching people, doing casting lessons, taking people out on the river and seeing, mistakes that I had made myself, in somebody else. And it helped me understand, the mechanics of the cast, why somebody wasn't catching a fish because they weren't mending at the right time, all these little things. But I think just taking a friend out, or taking a son or daughter out, or whomever it may be, but sharing the experience or your knowledge, no matter where you're at on the spectrum, or if you have some level of competency, sharing that with somebody else, not only, you're doing them the service, but it will make you a better angler. When you watch somebody else and try to explain to them, as you process it in your own head, why their cast keeps collapsing, why they keep throwing a taily loop. It's hard to self-diagnose, when you're the one doing it, but when you're watching somebody else, all of a sudden things start to click. So I think it's a good exercise to share what knowledge or what level of, experience you have with somebody else, because it does end up making you and them better. Touched on this with a couple of those stories I was telling earlier, but not just fishing prime conditions. Again, it's this idea of like, I think you will find more enjoyment and frankly end up getting more opportunities to get out there and fish if you expand your horizons a little bit. So, when things are less than ideal, you can still go and you may learn some things, or you may try some different things that you can then use later in a similar situation. I would also throw under this umbrella, like I talked about, branching out and trying different types of fishing, because it can help you with that, whatever that core thing. If you're a bass, bass fisherman primarily, or you're a steelhead fisherman, if you go and fish for other fish in other places, um, you can use things that you learn and apply them to a different scenario. And I think sometimes it's like, well, I wanted to go steelhead fishing today, but conditions aren't great. I'm going to go pike fishing, or I'm going to go try something that I haven't done this time of year because I'm always doing this one thing. So don't let a lack of good conditions, keep you from fishing, from getting out there. There's some other benefits too, like getting away from people. I talked about that. That's something I value more than ever. Learning your water. So, if it is your home fish or your core water, getting out there when conditions are less than ideal and seeing how those fish react to those conditions can teach you a lot. Forcing yourself to innovate, forcing yourself to get outside the box, try things, use flies, try techniques that you haven't used before. It makes you a better angler. And then, of course, I've gone fishing on days, where I thought the fishing was going to be crappy because of the conditions, and ended up having some of the best fishing, that I can remember. So get out there is the moral of the story. I want to pause there because I kind of want to shift gears a little bit. Is there anything that anybody has any questions about? It's not rocket science. Again, my goal here was just to give you some things to think about and reflect on. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about etiquette, which can be a touchy subject. But it's something I've noticed as, I talked about the surge in interest in the sport, and I really have seen it, especially last spring and fall, which is so many more people being on the river, which is great. But it can present challenges, and it can kind of generate these feelings. If you're somebody who normally is out on a particular piece of water a lot, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of people there that weren't there before or aren't there normally, it's easy to get bitter. And I felt those feelings, and I know a lot of other people have. But I think you have to think about it. And I think, the way I see it is like, if everybody was educated on a certain base standard of etiquette, like how should you expect to be treated on the water, and how should other people expect you to treat them? I think that bitterness would kind of, subside a little bit. So I want to be real clear. I'm like, I don't think there are hard and fast rules on river etiquette, or fly fishing etiquette in general. And it's subjective. It's different in different places for sure. And you kind of have to be in tune to that. But I do think that there's some general principles that make sense most of the time, and certainly wouldn't do you any harm. One thing is like introducing yourself. So what happens a lot, we talk about low holers, right? You're fishing and somebody jumps into the spot 30 feet downstream of you that you had probably planned on fishing a few minutes later, and it's easy to get upset. But I think one thing we can do is, introduce yourself and just say, hey, I'm Jimmy. Like, do you fish here often? Whatever. Just break the ice a little bit, because there's that like passive aggressive tension sometimes that builds in these kinds of situations. And more importantly, it's not if you're the angler and somebody else is stepping into your spot. It's you're approaching a spot and you're going to fish near that person. I feel like it's better to say, hey, how are you? Are you planning on moving downstream, upstream? Are you on your way out? Did you just get here? Do you mind if I jump in, in the run above you or whatever? That always goes better than the alternative. I told this story. There's two stories kind of related to this. I was guiding this fall, and I had a young kid who's probably like 15. I watched his dad drop him off at the river, and I was guiding. I had two anglers fishing, and I could tell this kid was really excited. And he came down. He was fishing a spinning rod, and he was directly across the river, standing on the opposite bank from where my two anglers were fishing. And he unhooked his lure, and he was about to cast in there. And I said, "Hey, buddy, do you mind starting upstream? Because we're fishing here, and we kind of just got here." He was like, "Oh, no problem." He goes upstream. He disappears for about a half an hour. He comes back downstream. Now he's on our side of the river, and he walks behind us and he jumps in immediately downstream, maybe 30 feet, like pretty close, too close. And one of the anglers that I was guiding was an older guy. He's fished a lot, and he just went off on this kid. He lit him up. He started screaming at him, dropping f-bombs. It was kind of ugly, and I could see that this kid was he was shocked. I mean, he obviously did not know that what he had done was against river etiquette. And that would have been his only education, right? We could have just let it go, and he probably would have ran off downstream, and that would have been his education on, what is appropriate river etiquette. And I felt like I had to go talk to him, and I went down and I said, hey, don't worry about that. I said, I will just tell you, normally, if you're going to jump in downstream of somebody, you want to ask them first, ask if they're fishing upstream or downstream, and see if they mind if you get in. And he was like so thankful that I had explained that to him. He's like, I'm really new to steelhead fishing. Like, where should I go? And then we had a nice conversation, and I tried to give him some tips and stuff. But, a lot of anglers, most of us probably never get any education. Nobody ever tells us like what is okay, what's too close, what's not too close. So I think just having that talk and knowing that like if somebody does that to you, they may not know what they're doing, and it's kind of on you to educate them, as best you can. Now I would say this because I don't want to paint myself as a saint. I have not always done this the right way, and in fact, after that happened, a few weeks later, I was fishing, and I have had so little time to fish with kids. I was really into it. I was all worked up, and I really wanted to catch a fish. And this guy comes from downstream. Now, this guy looked like he knew what he was doing. He was geared up, and he had all the right stuff. He looked like he should have known better. And I'm watching him. He starts walking towards the run that I was swinging, and he jumps right into the tail. I mean, almost in my cast, and starts fishing. And it was building as I watched him come, and I saw, I'm like, is he going to fish there? He's going to do it. He's going to do it. And it just built in me. And I go, are you really going to cast there, man? It could have been worse, but I could have been a lot nicer about it. And you could tell it rubbed him the wrong way. Never seen this guy before. Didn't know who he was. And, I had built up that inner, frustration, and I've just let it slip, and I thought about that for hours afterwards. That was a missed opportunity. It's hard to be perfect, but I think this is something that takes practice, and it's important because I think we're going to see when we get out of this winter, there's going to be so many people fishing. I don't care where you go. You're going to have a hard time getting away from people, and we all need to be nicer to each other as best we can. And it takes practice. Waiting your turn. So, a lot of this stuff I'm talking about, when I think about this, I think about it, up here, steelhead fishing on our rivers, because they tend to get really crowded, when the fishing is good. But not, even if you think you're at, a safe distance, and I don't mean COVID safe, but I'm not going to be in this person's way, giving people an opportunity to fish without feeling like they're being watched or crowded out is, it's something you would want. And so I think we should do that for other people. It's not jumping in and squeezing people if we don't have to, not hogging the run. So not staying in a spot all day, I think is important. I don't even like to fish that way, but there's some people that'll camp on a hole and stay there all day. And, I think it's better if you rotate the water a little bit for everybody. That goes hand in hand with working efficiently, sharing some information. We've all been in this position, and I've been on both sides of it, where, somebody walks up, an eager angler, and they're like, how's the fishing? And you're like, okay. Because you don't want to tell them that you just caught 5. And, there's a little bit of a game to play there, right? But I think there's a way to, if somebody's asking you for information, it depends on your experience level too, but how you react to that kind of says a lot about you and sets the tone for that interaction. And so, when people ask me, I'm like, it's pretty good. We're getting a few on woolly buggers, whatever. I try to give them something just because it breaks that tension a little bit. And sometimes that leads to really good conversation on the river too. And sometimes you learn something from that person. When I think about steelhead fishing, I'm trying to get as much data, as much information as possible about what those fish are doing on any given day. So if I can learn something from somebody else about, how their fishing's been or what they are or aren't having success with, I'm going to take that opportunity. I always say if you even have to ask or think about whether or not you're too close, you're probably too close. And again, this is different. You go to different rivers and different places, and people are more than comfortable fishing shoulder to shoulder. I can't do that anymore. I did that for a long time. To me, that's not the experience I'm looking for, but there are places where it's a necessary evil. And then this is a big one, dealing with guides. If you're on a river, or, if you're fishing a place that, that guides are working is, I think, and obviously it's perspective because I have guided anglers, but, I tend to think that you should defer to a working guide. Now, some people disagree with me, and that's why I said this is all subjective. But if you see that somebody is guiding somebody, and that those people are paying that person for that experience, they're not entitled to anything, and they should still be. In fact, they should be holding up all these things and exhibiting all these behaviors that I said, like to a T. So it's not that they're held to a different standard, but I do think that, like, if you have the opportunity, if you could just walk a little bit further and give a working guide some space, I think that's a good thing to do. And that's totally, it's like I said, this is a touchy one because some people have different perspectives on it. That etiquette thing is something that raises a lot of questions. So if you guys do have questions, throw them in the chat, or we can get to them later. I talked about this before, but I do think I have found that fishing different places, fishing for different fish, has made me a better all around angler, and it's just enriched my experience. So that's something I really encourage people to do especially if you're newer on the, on the fly fishing spectrum. It can be a lot to bite off. You can have one species is hard enough to learn how to catch, but I think you'll find that, like, trying different things will make you better and, give you more opportunity to get out and enjoy the sport. So I wanted to leave, I don't know how I did. I wanted to leave some time, for questions and chatting. I can ramble. So, like, we got about 10 minutes, and I'm happy to stay later. Like I said, I wanted this to be a dialogue and a conversation. So we'll open it up, Jess.
Cool.
Katie?
Did you want to unmute people, or let me see here.
Yeah, do I need to do that?
Katie, are you still the?
Yeah, I would just say if you have a question, type in the chat section that you have a question, and we'll just unmute you from there.
Ooh.
Are we at questions?